Hi, everybody. We're just waiting for our list to populate so that we know that we have the bulk of our attendees. We'll give it just one more minute. All righty. Welcome to HMB's webinar. This is our first webinar on this topic, preparing for employee COVID-19 claims. I think I know most of you on the phone. I'm Keith Burke, and I'll be moderating for the next 45 minutes. The goal of our webinar is to provide you with practical advice regarding COVID-19 related employee issues. Our attempt is going to be to try to simplify and give you business advice from a legal perspective. I'd like to start by introducing you to our panel and thanking them because our panel is Shelley Corn and Alicia Handy. Shelley and Alicia put together these slides, but even more importantly, I want to give you a little background. I've worked with Shelley for more than 20 years. Shelley leads our firm's employment practices and has taken the lead on our COVID-19 related employee practices. Shelley has been our guide on this journey to date and has been our leading voice on how businesses can return to work. And a lot of the presentation regarding how we return to work will be presented by Shelley. Alicia and I, unlike Shelley and I, have just started working together recently. But Alicia's background was so intriguing to be on this COVID task force. Alicia has a background in sciences and social policy, and of course she's a lawyer. Alicia's been monitoring the daily changes to COVID-19 related employment issues and developing a playbook of best practices. So I want to remind everybody, our speakers are real attorneys, not actors. So we're going to do the best we can of presenting. I will tell you the information we provide will be high quality. Hopefully our presentation of it will be much like you would look for somebody who's on an audio machine or a video machine. So hopefully we look like actors. Okay, our agenda. I'm out of order already. Our agenda: what to do when an employee has COVID, what to do when an employee group has been exposed to someone who has COVID, what to do when an employee calls in sick, claiming to have COVID, and then how do we get back to work? How do you do a reopening plan? What kind of employment policies should you be changing or looking at or revising? What contracts with vendors or suppliers should you be looking at that need to be revised? And then what insurance should you be reviewing, and how do you deal with those? All of the topics we present today are questions that we've received from clients of ours, or will be received from you in the audience. So there's a Q&A little icon at the either top of your screen or the bottom of your screen, depending on the device you're looking at. If you send a question, I will do my best to incorporate that into the questions we ask. If we don't get to your question, we can talk to you after the summer. Our format. Our framework. You know that there's lots of recommendations from the CDC, WHO, OSHA, the EOC, and it goes on, state, local government. We're going to try to provide you guidance on how that works. Keep in mind that all of the recommendations from these agencies are recommendations and they're baseline. It's our thought that you should follow at least the baseline, but you may need to do more. And remember that all of our answers are going to vary by what's your industry, what's your workforce, how do you interact with your customers and your employees? Are you a factory? Are you an office? And how do your employees get to work? And what's their surrounding community? Do they take public transportation or private cars? So with that, I would like to turn this over, and Alicia, tell us what you do when your employee has COVID.
Well, if your employee has tested positive for COVID, this is about as easy of a scenario as you're going to get. The guidance is pretty clear. You're going to send your employee home or not allow them to come back to work. Once you find out that an employee has COVID, that kickstarts your internal response. And Shelley will talk about this more later, but you should start notifying folks. That will include your management team responsible for your internal response, and then those employees that the sick employees have had contact with.
So, and when somebody says they have COVID, do you tell everybody else that that person has COVID?
You'll tell them that somebody has COVID, but you will not tell them who that person is. That violates several confidentiality requirements. But if you are, if you have employees that they work closely with, either they sit next to them, they have direct interactions through their jobs, those people should be notified immediately because they might have had a potential exposure.
So, well, let me ask you this. So, you know, somebody comes up to me and says, hey, Joe's not coming to work anymore. I heard he has COVID. How do I respond?
While it might be obvious who is sick, you cannot confirm as the employer which of your employees are actually sick and out on leave.
And let's go back to the person who has COVID. How do I know they have COVID?
You can request copies of their test results. You can request a note from their doctor. There's going to be some amount of trust that goes into this process between you and your employees, but for the most part, you can require documentation.
And do I have a reporting requirement either internally or externally to other people when somebody tells me that I know they have COVID?
At a minimum, you're going to start reporting internally, depending on what type of plan you put in place, either your HR professional, another senior manager. You're going to want to notify the people they've had close contact with, not even so much because it's a requirement by any law, but because these are people who now potentially have an exposure to COVID. And then you're going to need to make sure that those employees are not getting sick and potentially spreading it further. And then depending on your industry and your regulators, you might have a legal requirement to report in to your regulators.
Okay, so tell me this. So now we know that this individual has COVID. What benefits are they entitled to?
So this will vary. For people who are tested positive, they likely are eligible for paid sick leave under the new federal laws. Full-time employees are eligible for up to 80 hours. Employers can take a tax credit against their payroll taxes. Now,
so wait, let's investigate that for a second. So so I have an employee handbook that says you get some time off if you're sick. Mm-hmm. Do we go to that first, or we go first to the new CARE Act?
We go to the new CARE Act first. And then if they are really sick and the 80 hours is not sufficient, then you would go to your existing employee benefits, either sick leave, vacation time, unpaid leave. Maybe you have extra paid leave that they could take. But the first thing would be for the federal rules.
Okay, so you start with the new federal rule, but you do get a credit against that for your FICA taxes.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. And then after that, you go back to your regular employee handbook rules?
Yes. And if they're really sick and go beyond the federal provided leave and your employee benefits, then you're starting to look at whether or not they qualify for unpaid leave under various federal rules or state rules.
Okay. So now let's get to the tougher question. So now, you know, an employee having COVID, we talked about. And everybody's concerned of what their employees are going to think about in the workplace when they find out that somebody that they've worked with has COVID. So now we know that somebody has COVID, and our employee, you know, it goes like wildfire through our employee base. Mm-hmm. What do we do?
So you're going to have to start distinguishing between who's had an exposure and who hasn't and is just fearful. If you had a potential exposure, these are your employees who are in close proximity for prolonged periods of time. That is the person, if you're in the factory, sitting next to the person who is sick. That might be, if it's outside the workplace, it might be someone who lives with a family member who's sick. It might be the person who takes public transportation and happened to be on the bus with somebody who's sick. These are the next category of people who are at most risk of spreading and contracting coronavirus.
So let me ask you this. So, I tell my employees, you need to, stay away from crowds of people on the weekends. And I find out that they went, a bunch of employees had a picnic at somebody's house. And now they're concerned because somebody has COVID. It's not my problem. It didn't happen in my workplace. Do I have to do anything about that?
Yes. Once the person comes back to your workplace, it becomes your problem. It doesn't matter if the exposure happens in the workplace, at home, in the park, at a party. If they're your employee, it's your problem now.
And if the employee who has COVID doesn't return to work, but the people that have been exposed to that person at a picnic return to work, is that my problem?
Yeah. And then what to do with those employees, you have a couple of options. You can allow your employee to continue working, especially if you're in a business where there's a huge demand. Those are your meat packing facilities, maybe your grocery stores. You can allow those people to come back to work, but you should take additional safety precautions. Require them to wear masks, monitor their symptoms. Maybe you take temperatures on a daily basis. To the extent you can spread them out, maybe you practice social distancing. Or,
okay. But let me stop you there for a second. So that's if they're asymptomatic?
Yes.
Okay.
If you're symptomatic, you're going back to the first slide and you're sending them home.
Okay. So now let's say that I'm concerned about this group of 6 employees that I know were at a picnic. Can I require them to go get tested before I allow them back into work?
You can, and then those employees will be eligible for paid sick leave to go get that test. So that day that they're off, they are eligible for leave under the federal rules. If you want them to stay at home, then they're going to fall under your employee benefit package.
But let's stay in testing for 1 second, because this one really, in fact, there's a question on, so if they go to like the Illinois National Guard, it takes 5 to 7 days to get the test results.
Yes.
So what do I do in that 5 to 7 day period?
If they are eligible for leave, paid sick leave, paid vacation time, you should allow them to take that. And Shelley will talk about this more later also. If you're on an accrual basis for such leave, think about whether or not you allow them to accrue the leave faster so that they can take that time off.
But do I have to pay them under the CARE Act when they're asymptomatic and we're waiting for their test results?
No, it would just be that actual day that you go get tested. If they come back,
just to jump in there, if they went to get tested and the healthcare provider said that the person should quarantine or stay at home because of the exposure that they had, then they may qualify for leave under the federal laws.
But if they simply go to the Illinois National Guard and get swabbed and drive through, nobody tells them anything until they get a test result. And so during that period, they're not entitled to be paid for their time off under the CARE Act, but they may be under my employee policies, sick days and PTO time. Got it. Okay. And the CDC isn't necessarily encouraging people to get tested, but would we encourage our clients to have people who've been exposed get tested?
Correct. The CDC is not requiring it because they're trying to minimize people coming in and they're trying to minimize the overwhelming healthcare systems. But you can, there's nothing prohibiting you from requiring your employees to get tested. And especially if they've had an exposure, it's not a bad idea to have them go get tested. Okay,
so now let's flip it. And they've all been to the picnic, and a couple of them have some symptoms of either a cold, the flu, or COVID. What do I do with that group?
So if they have been exposed and they're symptomatic, and the CDC is updating its list of symptoms pretty regularly, you're sending them home. You're treating them as if they have COVID-19.
And what do you suggest we do for, as this spreads like wildfire through my workplace, that this group was at a picnic and we don't tell anybody who their names are, but everybody knows anybody anyway. But what do we do about trying to give reassurance to the workforce of, on our list is cleaning protocols, but, how do you reassure your workforce that we're doing everything we can to keep you safe?
We'll talk about this more later also, but it's really important to communicate regularly. If you feel like you're over communicating, you're probably not doing it enough. They need to be assured that they're safe. There's a lot of unknowns, including in the scientific committee, about what's happening. So the more you communicate about what you're doing, the more relief you're providing for your employees. And to the extent that you can implement steps that might not be things that you would think about under normal circumstances, now's the time to implement those.
Okay, so Alicia, those were my easy questions. Now let me give you a couple of the hard ones that I'm getting. Okay, your employee calls, emails, and says, I have COVID, not coming to work, pay me for the 80 hours. So let's start with, how do we respond to that employee?
So part of your communication plan should be to explain to your employees what type of leave options are actually available. People keep hearing, oh, there's leave available under these new federal rules, but not everyone is eligible for that leave. You're only eligible in these circumstances if you're actually sick or if you're going to get a medical diagnosis.
So let me ask you, because I'm always confused. I'm told I can't ask people about their health. I can't ask them about all kinds of stuff. And all of a sudden COVID comes into play. Can I say to an employee, well, you say you have COVID. Tell me what your symptoms are.
You can. You can do that. You can ask them to go get tested. If they refuse, you don't have to provide them leave. There's actually requirements that they provide, the employee provides documentation to the employer in order to be eligible to take leave. If they want to take their 20 hours of vacation time under their employee benefits, they can do that, but then they're also added it in the case of an emergency.
Can I require a doctor's note?
You can, and you probably should, as part of your file for their documentation.
And so I don't have to pay that employee under the CARE Act
Right.
until they've proven that they have COVID.
Right.
And if they fail, and until they prove it, correct? So if they go and it's a 5 to 7 day wait, I don't pay them for the 80 hours while we're waiting for the results.
Correct. Yep, and it'll be important that employees understand that they might run out of paid leave. So to the extent they just want to take paid leave because they're fearful or they might just want to break, if they do end up getting sick, paid leave might not be available at some point.
Okay. And what happens if they call up and they say, I can't come to work because I have an aging parent, and I'm afraid of giving them COVID, or I have childcare needs? What are they entitled to under those kinds of scenarios?
So they might be eligible for leave under paid leave or unpaid leave under different portions of the federal rules. But in terms of the paid sick leave requirements, you either need to be sick or somebody else needs to be sick. And depending on the circumstances, we can walk through the different scenarios that allow for different types of coverages. But that's very employee specific.
So some of what we've talked about is generic. Let's hone in on that a little bit. I'm in an environment where my vice president of sales, who's my best friend, calls me and says, I have COVID. And I said, oh my God, are you okay? And what can we do to help you? Mm-hmm. Versus I have a factory with 1,500 workers and somebody who has a history of absenteeism calls up and claims COVID. Do I have to treat them the same?
You don't have to, but then how you do treat them will sort of vary depending on the risk profile of your place of employment. So if you have the vice president who can work from home, it almost doesn't matter if you believe them or not, because they can work from home. So long as they otherwise feel okay, there's nothing stopping them from working. If you have the factory worker who has to be present in order to do their job, whether or not you believe them will then determine what you do next. If you don't believe them, you can require them to go get testing. You can tell them not to come back until they get their test results. what leave is available to them, as we discussed before, will vary. The risk of forcing them to come back is that if they are sick, you risk exposing your other employees. So it's going to be a balancing act between needing your employees to come in, believing that your employees are sick or not sick, and then reducing the spread within your workplace.
Yeah, but I want to focus on this notion of discrimination in the workplace. So what I think you're saying is I can differentiate between those in a trusting environment that I know well and have good records of employment versus those that I don't trust. But what happens if everyone I trust is the classic white male and everyone I don't trust is minority? Do I get into discrimination issues?
Well, so part of your plan is to just understand what is your environment in which you're working in, develop the plan based on that environment, and then implement the plan consistently. So maybe if you have 100 employees, half of them you trust, half of them you don't trust, you're going to treat all the employees the same, assuming no one can be trusted. So you will require everyone to go to get tested. You will require
My last question for you. You ready? My last one. Okay. When can they come back?
All right. So the CDC has guidance on this. Some of it would probably surprise you. So if you are asymptomatic, that'll determine on whether or not you've had a positive test result or just a potential exposure. If you had a positive test result, you're looking at a minimum 10 days, so long as you don't get sick. If you have a potential exposure, you're looking at 14 days. And the difference is, and the CDC recognizes this difference, this is because it takes about 14 days for symptoms to present themselves. And so they want to give people time to actually work through that process.
So the bizarre part is you can actually be out of work for a shorter period of time with COVID.
Yep.
And if you've simply been exposed to COVID and never get it.
Yes. And quite frankly, these numbers might go up. So you're looking at a minimum of 10 to 14 days at this point. These numbers used to be 7 days for the positive test results. So keep up with these because they might change again within the next month or so as scientists learn more. For symptomatic, you're looking for a reduction in your symptoms. Again, you're at a minimum of 10 days, but you're also looking for your ability to breathe again, your ability to keep a low fever.
Or to breathe again.
You want your fever reduced without medication. So keep an eye on that. You're going to have to, again, trust your employees because they're not necessarily going to have a doctor's note that allows them to come back.
Alicia, this has been really informative. Thank you. We're now going to flip over to Shelley, and Shelley's going to tell us how we avoid all of these issues with employees by doing pre-planning. So Shelley, tell us how we get back to business.
Great. Thank you, Alicia and Keith, for your guidance. First, I wanted to note that in this webinar, we're all coming from different types of businesses. Some of us manage essential businesses that require in-person operations and have already begun to implement workspace changes. Others have continued operations by implementing emergency plans and transforming in-person workforces into telework forces. Others have furloughed or terminated employees and are hoping to get back to business. In any event, all of us are looking forward to next steps. We want our businesses to have a chance to recover, to survive, and hopefully even thrive during this pandemic. But
Let me ask you a quick question here. Does it matter if I'm an essential business or a non-essential business on what you're about to describe on how we open?
I think in all cases, what we need to do is to examine what our businesses look like and put together a plan on how we reopen. So it could be essential, it could be non-essential. I think what we need to ask ourselves are what our best next steps are. So just getting back to that, if you want to move the slide forward, Alicia, what we're looking at next is we want to have this plan for reopening that Alicia discussed and Keith had mentioned. And this plan is going to be very individual to your business. As mentioned earlier, there's a lot of guidance out there about when, how, and under what circumstances you should reopen. But the first step has to be to create a pandemic response team. Or if you already have one in place, you need to direct that team to put together a reopening plan. The PRT is made up of key managers, including your HR executive or the person who leads your HR efforts, and possibly staff members. A key member, your reopening plan will likely reflect your management's style. In factory settings, the reopening plan will likely be determined by a management team. And in a small office setting, the PRT may request contributions from all staff members. Mid-sized offices may use a combination of rules set by management and input received from staff. You also need to realize that your plans will vary based on the personality types in your workforce. To be successful at your company, is your staff composed mainly of type A personalities or people who are more relaxed? You need to consider what and to what extent your employees will be watching what other people will be doing and how comfortable they'll feel in your workspace. And
Shelley,
yeah.
let me ask you, would you advise, some companies I know are doing employee surveys to figure out how people get to work and what their concerns are, what their risk profiles are. Would you encourage that or discourage that?
I think more information is helpful. What you have to be careful about is collecting information and then not responding to it. So if you have employees who say, I'm very concerned, I have a specific disability, and then we don't later engage that person to determine what type of accommodations they need, we could run into issues. But overall, the idea of collecting more information about what employees' concerns are and how we can address them in the workplace creates a path of communication with our employees and helps build reassurance that we're putting together a plan that makes sense for everyone. So if you want to move on to the next slide, when we're putting together the plan, we should look at state and local orders, and we also have to understand that they will be rapidly changing and that we need to review what our limitations will be when we reopen. We also want to do a hazard and risk assessment and a business assessment. So with respect to the hazard and risk assessment, on the next slide, what would be a practical tip is to have a couple of people who are in your workplace practice a day, see what it's like, and take detailed notes on what we could be doing to reduce the risk of the transmission of COVID in the workplace. So you can start with, how do people get to your office? Do employees drive? Do they take public transportation? Are there doors to enter to get into the lobby? Can they social distance in the lobby? Are they going to take an elevator to your office, or are they taking an escalator? And what steps your building's taking to make sure that all of these areas are cleaned and disinfected on a regular basis. You should also consider whether you require masks in your workspace or if they'll be optional. If people are going to be within 6 feet of each other, you should provide them masks. And you shouldn't just provide them, you should also train people on how to use them.
So, Shelley, when we talk about masks, are we talking about N95 masks? Are we talking about surgical masks? Are we talking about decorative masks?
Well, it depends on your work environment. Some work environments will require an N95. So somebody who's going in to clean or disinfect the workspace will likely want to be using the N95, have other protective gear on. But your office employee, they're not going to be able to use an N95 on a daily basis within their workspace for 8 hours.
I tried one and almost suffocated.
Right. Yeah, they're not that easy. And like you said, if somebody's going to be using one, you actually have to do an assessment, a health assessment, as to whether or not the person can get enough oxygen while they're wearing the N95. And then if you've determined they can, then you actually have to train them on how to use the N95 so that they use it in a safe manner. And OSHA has lots of guidance on how to use the N95s. Are also called respirators. So when you put all these things in place, what do you do with your recalcitrant employee who walks around the office without a mask or walks around the factory without a mask? That's a good question. Part of the reopening plan is having a complaint procedure in place so that if an issue comes up, an employee can report it to the PRT or to the head of that team to ask that the issue be investigated. And there should be a prompt investigation. It would be similar to like a harassment investigation. There should be an interview of the people involved. There should be a collection of evidence. There should be an evaluation of the information that was provided. And finally, a report should be issued, and the person who complained, as well as the alleged rule breaker, should be advised of best next steps.
But the bottom line is that if your employer, or if you as the employer want to require people to wear a mask, that is now a condition of work, and if you don't do it, you can be terminated. Is that correct?
You can put in place those rules in your office. This is a whole new time. It's a pandemic, and we can take different efforts. Alicia, if you want to move to the next slide, OSHA has prepared a helpful guide titled Guidance on Preparing Workplaces for COVID-19. Also, Illinois has issued additional guidance for workplace safety for employees and businesses. And just yesterday, the Department of Labor issued a report that OSHA has seen an uptick in complaints. I believe there were almost 1,200 that have been filed specifically related to COVID-19. In Illinois, the Attorney General has set up a workplace hotline to call if people have complaints. And we've also noted that that hotline is being used as a disgruntled employee hotline. But we should note that, like the situation you described earlier, Keith, if an employee whistleblows, if they make a complaint because they had concerns that a rule or a law was being violated, they'll be protected as a whistleblower. With respect to these investigations, there's been a variety of different protocol taken. First, we've seen employers being contacted for a telephone interview, and others have led to in-person examinations of what the workspace looks like. You should be prepared to designate a member of your PRT to respond to these questions, and make sure that whoever's answering your phone knows to direct those calls to the PRT person who is ready and has ready access to your reopening plan, so that you can say what your company's doing to be compliant. I think it'd be terrible.
I'm sorry, is this reopening plan published in writing to the employee group, or is it just an internal document that you have?
Well, there should probably be two portions. One would be an internal protocol that develops and changes, and then there's going to be a part of it that's going to be communicated to the employees. I'm not sure they need to know everything that we're considering as part of the reopening plan, but we do want to be transparent on the safety efforts that we're making to make sure that employees feel safe in the workplace, and that their employer is looking out for their best interests, and that there's no hazards in the workplace, or limited hazards in the workplace. Which gets me to my next slide, is our plan needs to include methods for identifying and isolating sick people. The EOC has said that we're allowed to screen employees. We can take people's temperatures. We can require COVID testing. And we need to, as part of the reopening plan, we need to consider whether or not we want to start doing these things, because there's added responsibility when we start testing people, especially in terms of confidentiality. Like if you have everyone line up at your workspace to get in, one, you have to figure out how to do it in a manner that they socially distant, but then how do you call off the person who has a fever and say, Joe, you've got 100 fever? We can't do that. It's confidential information. So there's a lot that has to go into figuring these protocols out.
So Shelley, a couple of issues have risen. I've gotten a couple of questions. So in trying to keep people away from each other in the office space, are you required to close public areas like your kitchen?
So you're not required to, but if you do leave them open, you want to make sure that they're cleaned and disinfected regularly. That definitely could be a source for transmission of COVID.
And let's just ask a practical question. You might not have the answer to this one. So if you don't provide coffee in your kitchen to your employee group in the morning, are they all going to get coffee at a restaurant before they come in? And is that better or worse? And what behavior are you trying to create?
I hear you. Those are difficult. Some companies are actually requesting that people bring everything that they want during the day. So from it, food, water, coffee, whatever they're going to require during their day, they're asking people to come into the office and bring all those things with them so that they're not using shared workspaces. Get into your space, plant, and don't move to the extent it's possible.
So now the second question I've gotten is, let's go back to the people. And you said we can do screening and testing and ask questions. So what do we do with employees that are not fully cooperative? Is that?
We can exclude them from the workplace. I mean, we have this is a pandemic. This is unusual times. If somebody doesn't want to comply with our protocols, we don't have to let them into our workspace.
So in the past, when I've worked with you on things like reduction of workforces and things like that, you've taken a lot of effort to determine if there's discrimination either in concept or practice of employee groups. When you're doing these screenings and these protocols, do you have to take the same concern about discrimination against different groups of people?
Absolutely. You can't just pick on one group and pick the people over 40 and say, look, you're in a separate group because you're more likely to get sick. So we're going to follow, your temperature. We're going to require health screenings from you. Or look, Keith, you like to travel. We're going to have different rules for you. We need to have consistent rules for all people in the workplace.
So can I say to somebody who works with me, hey, listen, you don't look very healthy. I know you have a lot of doctor's visits. You probably are not a good person to come back to work right now. Now, that may be a very rough way of saying it, but can you do things like that in a more gentle manner?
Well, I don't think you would target that particular person. Instead, it's more to the surveys that you were talking about before, is reaching out to people and generally seeing if they have concerns. And if they have concerns, to bring them to your HR professional or that member of the PRT team to figure out if people need accommodations in order to continue working.
So a related question about, what you can do with your employee group. I've been known once in a while to go to Florida in the winter and golf a little bit. Can you require me to quarantine for 14 days if I travel before I return to the office?
Yes, you can, or I can require that. If I was in charge of your plan, I would definitely have that. But that's the idea of planning, is that you're putting these ideas down on paper before you take that trip, so it doesn't look like it's a knee-jerk reaction to the over this age person taking the trip. So you have your guidelines, you have your rules in place. They may change as we get more information, and they should change as we get more information. But what we want to try to do is create a consistent set of policies for the workplace.
So can you have a different set of policies for your office staff versus your, and the reason I'm asking this is you have an office staff that's capable of teleworking, and you have a factory or warehouse staff that has to physically be there. Can you require your office staff to quarantine for 14 days after travel, but not require that of your warehouse or manufacturing plant?
So I would recommend, so first, if you have a workforce that can telework, just because, states are reopening and people are allowed to be in their workspaces where they weren't before, we're still going to recommend that if it's possible that you try to have employees continue to telework. So in that instance, you would definitely have the people who can telework continue teleworking.
Okay, so I'm trying to get all our questions in, but I don't want to stop you from finishing your presentation. So I'm going to stop asking a question and let you continue, because there's good stuff to come.
Okay, so if we could go to the next slide, Alicia. So the first key to a successful plan is that you communicate it with your employees. The more you communicate and address their concerns, the more confidence your employees will have that you're anticipating, preparing, and taking the best actions to protect them. We also believe that a successful plan will be based on regular updates to the plan, taking into account new guidance that's issued, and giving your PRT, your team, the ability to and the tools to enforce the plan. So next, so you have a plan to reopen, what do? Well, you need to go back and look at your attendance policies. The government right now is requesting that you allow more flexibility, and your employees are likely needing more flexibility for their illnesses, for themselves, for their families, possibly for childcare and for elder care. But when you're developing these policies, they need to reflect that it's for COVID-related absences. With respect to teleworking, as I mentioned earlier, if you can continue teleworking, consider allowing employees to continue that. On the next slide, for your at-risk employees, you should be prepared to receive requests for accommodations and be ready to engage in discussions regarding proposed accommodations. And if you've allowed people to telework for the last couple of months, it's now going to be very difficult to say that teleworking is an undue hardship on the company.
And Shelley, at-risk employees, are those just employees that themselves have physical illness, or does that include what their home environments are and other things?
I think you probably should take into account, all the circumstances that an employee is in. So if they live with their older parents, or if they live with babies, or variety of people, or if they're responsible for taking care of those people, you would consider what accommodations are appropriate. There's going to be a difference between what's required under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Illinois Human Rights Act, and what we actually want to do to support our employees. And the EOC right now is encouraging us to be very creative and flexible and in our response.
Okay, so we only have about 3 more minutes. Give us a quick update on employee benefits and why are those relevant to COVID claims?
Sure. So right now, people are looking at their workforces and how they bring them back, and there's changes. Not everything looked like it did 2 months ago. Even this morning, I heard that we should anticipate that health insurance costs are going to rise exponentially. We might have bonus plans in place, and those bonus plans, the financial projections just don't make sense anymore. You could also have like a phantom stock plan that could vest too quickly for your current business needs. And it makes sense to go back and look at what your plans are and agreements are, because this is a time that you may need to adjust those plans. On the next slide, I'm addressing what happens with respect to companies that rely on temp agencies and staffing companies. If you have employees that come from those backgrounds, you should review the agreements to make sure that the workers that you're receiving have had background checks and been appropriately vetted. You also want to make sure that the staffing company is consistently communicating your workplace guidelines so that you can create a safe atmosphere for all of your workers. You also want to, yeah.
Sorry, I just got to ask you, vetted. What do you mean vetted? How can we vet these people that come through temp agencies? What are we looking for? Tests, of non-COVID, negative COVID tests?
Yeah, so it could be a variety of things. One would be a background check. Another area that you could possibly implement would be a health questionnaire. You can have people certify, and you can ask your staffing company to have their employees, right? Because they're the employees of the staffing company present daily health questionnaires, having the employees make representations that they don't have COVID, they aren't subject, they don't have any symptoms of COVID, that they haven't been exposed to COVID, that they haven't failed to comply with the law regarding social distancing.
Got it.
We'd also suggest that you look at your other workplace vendor agreements and any other agreements you have in place for your workspace.
All right, give me 30 seconds on insurance. Why is that relevant?
Okay, so right now we are seeing upticks in employment claims, and we're anticipating that they are going to be coming along with this crisis. So you should work with your broker regarding coverage for employment practices. Look to see whether or not you have or whether it's appropriate to put in place employee honesty and business interruption insurance. These policies may provide additional benefits that help you sustain your business during this time.
Okay. So listen, I know that I've been peppering you guys fast and hard with questions, and you were great. Some of those came from the audience. I want to thank everybody who is attending for your questions. Thank you for spending time with us. We hope it was helpful to you. Special thanks to Shelley and Alicia. You guys did great. Appreciate all your work in making this happen. If anyone would like a copy of the presentation, or if you have questions, please call or email Shelley, Alicia, or myself. Please be safe, be healthy. Thank you.